IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, and welcome to the All Things Policy podcast. Today, I am your host. My name is Rohan Pai, and I am in conversation with Josiah Neal.
Yes, thank you, Rohan.
Okay, so today we are talking about MATES, which is a new partnership or a new scheme between India and Australia. It stands for the Mobility Arrangement for Talented Early Professionals Scheme. It was established under the MMPA, which stands for the Migration and Mobility Partnership Agreement, and it enables the temporary mobility of Indian university graduates and early career professionals. MATES aims to encourage mutually beneficial skills and knowledge transfer between Australia and India. So I'm going to just set some context for MATES before we start the podcast. So MATES actually is very attractive because one of its primary factors is that applicants for MATES do not need sponsorship from an Australian employer to be eligible for the scheme. This opens very exciting opportunities for young professionals who seek to build careers in Australia without the usual employer sponsorship constraints. MATES is very important because it lasts for up to 2 years, and people who are granted the visa can live and work in Australia for up to 2 years. They don't need to work in their nominated field of study, but that is encouraged so that they can utilize their time to expand their skills and networks, and especially in the specified sectors. These sectors include renewable energy, mining, engineering, information communications technology, artificial intelligence, financial technology, and agricultural technology. So in order to apply for the MATES scholarship or the MATES visa, people need to be 30 or younger at the time of application. They need to have proficient English language skills, and they need to be fresh graduates, which means they need to have graduated from an eligible educational institution within the past 2 years. So now I think I will hand over the mic to Josiah with my first question. Josiah is from Australia, so I wanted to ask him a specific question. Josiah, as an Australian yourself, what are your immediate thoughts on MATES?
Yeah, so I saw the announcement of this new scheme, and I thought that it was obviously, first and foremost, an excellent opportunity for young people or for early career professionals in India to come to Australia. Of course, as an Australian, I'm very biased about my country and about how good my country is. And so the more people that get to experience that, the happier I am. But I think that it's clearly a very mutually beneficial arrangement. I think that obviously the labor oversupply in India is well documented, and with a growing population, with a very large youth population, the demand is definitely there. The demand is there in Australia for labor, and India has that supply. So you mentioned that it's in very specific sectors. I think those are sectors which the Australian government has determined that we want to be a leader in moving forward. You'll see that many of them are connected to key Australian industries, so agriculture, mining, and hopefully moving to the future as well, a bit more technology and computing. Australia's hoping to make some strides in that space. So I'm looking forward to helping welcome more Indian young people to Australia on this program. And I hope as well that it provides more of an opportunity for Australians to learn about India, to learn about the incredible diversity and the same things that I've kind of experienced in my time here of India. I hope that more Australians can learn that from the people who come in on this visa program.
Yeah, that's very true. And you mentioned that the MATES scheme was mutually beneficial. So I want to ask you, do you believe that it would result in equally positive outcomes for both India and Australia? Or do you think one country would benefit more than the other?
It's hard to say, considering that it was only announced very recently. And of course, I'm sure that both governments will keep a track of the outcomes from this initiative. But I think that on the face of it, it seems like it would be mutually beneficial. The hope would be that young Indians come to Australia, they have the opportunity to become an expert or to develop their expertise in a specific field that's somewhat connected at least to their field of study. And then they have the opportunity, if they really like Australia, if they want to stay there and continue to contribute to Australian society, then they can apply for another visa, or they can apply for permanent residency. I think that's an interesting inclusion in the MATES program, is that you can't reapply, and you can't apply if you've had been on it previously. So it's a one and done situation. The other option, of course, is that once they've finished their 2-year stint, those Indian graduates who now have more experience in a different country, perhaps in a different sector, and have been able to, for example, practice their English skills and things like that, they can then return to India and bring that experience back with them and help to build the Indian economy in that specific area. So I think that hopefully it's going to encourage more bilateral labor flows between the two countries. It might also encourage more companies in Australia to open operations in India or to invest in India once the value of Indian labor and especially of skilled labor is demonstrated through this MATES program. So from this point of view, at least, or at this point in time, I think that it's hopefully very mutually beneficial, but I guess we'll see in the long term.
Yeah, I do agree that it is important to contribute to society when you immigrate to them, when you immigrate to a new country. And I think it's important to talk about Australia specifically in this context, because according to a 2020 statistic, approximately 29.1% of the Australian resident population were actually born overseas. And Australia is known to be one of the highest in this regard among the Western world. So do you think MATES, which would encourage further immigration in the long term and the short term, is required at this point in time? Or do you think Australia is sufficient with its immigration at the moment?
Sure, that's a good question. And there's plenty of domestic debate about that. There's long been a division in Australia between those who have the opinion that Australia should be a small Australia and those that have the opinion that it should be a big Australia in terms of population. So whether we should simply rely on natural increase to sustain our population, but with that comes less economic growth, less activity, economic activity, or a big Australia, which is where you supplement that with immigration to fill skills shortages and help drive more economic growth and more productivity. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think as well that specifically MATES' influence on this is going to be minuscule, right? You need to look at the entire sort of remit of Australia's immigration policy to determine the kind of effect that's going to have on both sociologically and economically in Australia. I think the pilot program for MATES is offering 3,000 places. In the grand scheme of things, that's a drop in the ocean. So I think that it's not going to have much in effect. And also, as far as I know, as of recently, the Australian Bureau of Statistics pointed out that after people from England, or from the United Kingdom rather, India is the second largest diaspora of people in Australia. So Australians who are born overseas, they are mostly born in the UK, but then the second highest number is born in India. So I think that most Australians are very familiar with the Indian diaspora. Most of us have Indian Australian friends. And so it's not something new. It's not something that's going to be particularly jarring or particularly unexpected, whether it's for people in the community, whether it's for employers, whether it's for people who might have a colleague who comes in under the MATES scheme. It's really not going to change much. It's not going to alter the makeup of Australian society. So
yeah, it's quite interesting that Australia has so many diasporas and which are so rich and cultural, because until as recently as 1973, the White Australia policy was in effect, and this largely forbade people of non-European ethnic origin from immigrating to Australia. So what do you think changed in the last 50 years with respect to immigration in Australia?
So I think that the first thing that you have to remember is that the White Australia policy, however sort of detestable, was I think, at least in part, an attempt to. It was in part a version of McCarthyism. So it was aimed at curbing immigration from potentially communist countries. during the Cold War period, and there was things like the war in Vietnam and other associated events at that time, which made Australian society probably like incorrectly, but nevertheless, it made them suspicious of non-Caucasian immigrants, which is very unfortunate. I think what changed is that immediately after the Cold War period, we saw globalization took off. We saw the liberalization of many trade barriers between a lot of countries. And it became increasingly aware that, I think Western countries, including Australia, became increasingly aware that their dwindling aging populations weren't going to be able to support the kind of economic growth, and the corporate side of the Western world realized that it was going to be much cheaper to bring in laborers from other countries or to outsource the labor to other countries. And so that resulted in more relaxed immigration policies. And a big part in Australia's story as well has been the emergence of our educational institutions. So many of our educational institutions actually almost depend on international students for their revenues. There's just not enough people in Australia to prop up our university sector. And so international students became a very important point or a very important source of income for those institutions, both from India, but also from China and Japan and other places. And so that's really what's shaped it. So over time, it's liberalized. It's still fairly difficult, I would say, especially in comparison to some other Western countries like, say, Canada, to become a permanent resident in Australia or a citizen. The bar there is still quite high, and I think to a certain extent, rightly so. But being temporarily in Australia, there's many pathways, and it also depends a lot on the country that you're from. So that's really what's changed, and I think that overall it's a positive shift. And obviously, you would think so, considering how disappointing the White Australia policy was. And I think as well that Australia has struck a good balance in terms of a multicultural experiment. You see in some other Western countries where you have very liberal immigration. It caused like sociological divides or issues. And then you have other countries where they are very stringent with their immigration policies, and the sort of, the corollary problem is that their societies become very sort of ethnically and culturally homogenous, and also they inherently admit that they're willing to stunt their economic growth or even the diversity of ideas and diversity of thought in their societies. Like the best way to have new ideas, the best way to innovate, which drives economic prosperity, is to have people solving the same problem but coming at it from different points of view. And so those countries with stringent immigration policies probably won't have that same opportunity. And so I think that Australia has struck a good balance. And I think there's only a few other countries, at least in the Western world, but also I would say that the Western world is the most open to immigration of them all. But Australia is one of those countries that has actually reached a very good middle ground when it comes to immigration policy.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
I'm actually glad you brought up the fact that many of these educational institutions actually depend on international students to remain in business, because the statistics actually do reflect that. The Department of Home Affairs in Australia granted 382,000 student visas between July 2022 and February 2023. This is a 41.3% increase compared to the same period in 2019-2020, and this was pre-pandemic. So what, in your opinion, are the primary reasons for choosing to study in Australia as opposed to, say, Europe or North America?
For a student from India, that is?
Sure, but we could maybe address all countries at the same time.
Sure. So I think particularly, we'll speak to where the demand is. The demand is in Asia at the moment. In the future, it'll probably be in Africa. Okay. But at the moment, the demand for education primarily comes from Asia. So the primary reason has been proximity. So Australia is a 14-hour flight from where we are here in Bengaluru. And so comparatively, I think the UK is at least 2 flights away through the UAE or somewhere similar. And the United States is even further away. So Australia has been relatively closer. That matters not only in terms of the cost and the time that it takes to get there to study, but also things like time zone differences when you're calling home definitely should be taken into account. In addition to that, I think that Australia's student visa scheme is very efficient. I know that student visas are approved remarkably quickly compared to other countries in Australia. And we also have a reasonable number of privileges that you have on a student visa. So, for example, you can work, I think, immediately after the pandemic, it was actually unlimited. But generally, both pre-pandemic and now, again, since July this year, you can work up to 20 hours per week. So you can have a part-time job in addition to studying in Australia. And so that obviously allows international students to support themselves. I think as well that Australian education, although it's by no means cheap by maybe Indian or other developing country standards, I think that it's cheaper than education in the US or the UK, but it is still internationally recognized as well. And we have some excellent programs and some excellent universities that are world renowned in very specific fields. And we have good engineering and medical schools, for example, particularly. And so I think that that also tailors to a certain extent to the market. And so, that's there's some of the reasons. And I mean, there's a lot of others, beaches, kangaroos, but I think that they're the main drivers for the demand for Australia. But arguably the biggest factor has been proximity, geographic proximity.
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought about the time difference thing because you actually video call your family back home pretty often, and I realize now why it must be a lot easier than if you were in a different country. Right. So there has been a rise in immigration and a rise in especially Indian students, but it's actually quite surprising because just a decade ago, there was actually a 46% drop in Indians applying for student visas to Australia from July to 31st October 2009 compared to the same period in 2008. And this was largely due to the increased incidence of violence against Indian students. So just to give some context to people who aren't aware, in the year 2007 and 2008, over 1,447 Indians had been victims of crime, including assaults and robberies in the state of Victoria. So given this rise in immigration, the negative perceptions of the country actually appear to have reduced quite a bit in the last decade. So do you have any possible theories or explanations for this drastic shift in perception?
Yes, I think I think primarily those instances of violence. You'll notice that the 2007 to 2009 period coincides with the global financial crisis. And unfortunately, when times get tough, sometimes instead of taking responsibility for their own actions, people look for someone to blame. And unfortunately, sometimes the easiest people to blame are those that aren't similar to you. So I think that perhaps was a stressor in Australian society at that time on a lot of people. And you can't tell when you look at someone on the street whether they're a student. So I think that the narrative that was popular at the time was that immigration was stealing Australian jobs. And it's a very familiar sort of story that you hear in a lot of countries. And it's like a common, I guess, flavor of xenophobia. I think since then, Australia has, we came out of the GFC actually better off than a lot of countries. And we have realized that we have an aging population. We have realized that we have labor shortages and that we need workers, especially in areas where the interest just isn't there in Australia. And so there's been a lot of people have become more open to immigration, but that's also been because since the global financial crisis, we've basically had unparalleled prosperity on the back of industries like our mining and agriculture industries. So I think that when times are going good, people probably don't mind. And unfortunately, certain people when times get tough, draw the wrong conclusions or make the wrong inferences. But hopefully, I think as well that the immigrants that came to Australia, ever since the liberalisation of our immigration policy since the early 2000s, they've also now had children. So we have second generation immigrants, pardon me. And so that means that more Australians, at least what you would call Caucasian Australians, have slowly adjusted, or there's a new generation coming through, which is much more comfortable and much more aware that we live in a multicultural country. There's no way that you're ever going to be able to work with people that were all born in Australia because of, that statistic, like a third of the country was born overseas.
Yeah.
And so it's, there's just been that sort of underlying cultural shift as well. And I think that the numbers have also rebounded because other countries that were maybe, especially for students, you're talking about student visas. I think for students, we talked about some of the reasons why Australia is preferable. I think that some of the other options, like the US and the UK, like the UK, for example, exited the European Union. The US has been, has encountered some of its own internal social issues or societal issues. And so I think Australia has actually just as well benefited from perhaps like those destinations reducing in their attractiveness. And so it's sort of emerged as the key destination or the preferred destination.
Yeah, there is reason to believe that the whole violence against Indian students was blown out of proportion by the media, because there is a very strong opinion which says that many of these students who experienced the attacks tended to live in cheaper and more distant suburbs where there was already an increased risk of encountering violent crime. So could the students just be in the wrong place at the wrong time rather than it being a racially motivated attack? What do you think?
I think that's unfortunately, the motives of the people who commit these kind of crimes is perhaps never clear. But that certainly would be a factor. It would also be a factor that perhaps the people living in less privileged or poorer neighborhoods, international students, unfortunately, because they've moved countries, because their university fees are quite high from their point of view, and because they have full-time studies, so they can only work so many hours. That means that they have to choose those areas. That also means that they're in areas where the Australians around them might be not as well off or poorer, and that they accommodate some of the attitudes that I mentioned before. So that is a possible reason. But although I wouldn't want to draw the conclusion as well that sort of working class Australians are also racist. Unfortunately, people of all socioeconomic class can be racist. But I think that, it's potentially more of a unfortunate coincidence. I don't think that those attacks, or I don't think the majority of those attacks potentially were racially motivated. Unfortunately, criminals, just in general, will go for who they see as, the weakest target, right? Or the most vulnerable. And international students are definitely one of those groups because they're far away from home. They don't know how to navigate the country they're in. They might be concerned or afraid about going to the police, especially if where they come from, not necessarily India, but especially if the country that they come from, the police take bribes, Thailand is a good example. And so and there's a lot of barriers there and a lot of concerns that they might hold about, going to being involved with the justice system and things like that. And so, that all of those factors combine. But I think that those specific instances as well definitely drew awareness to providing resources for the safety and security of international students. And there's been, I know, a big push right up until recently for more dedicated international student housing on university campuses, which obviously have dedicated security staff. And it was actually there was actually a proposal recently that universities, someone proposed recently that Australian universities should be responsible for housing all of their international students as a way of easing rental demand because we have a bit of a housing shortage in Australia at the moment. But yeah, back to your question, I think that it was probably just a combination of factors. And unfortunately, there probably will always be people who, think the wrong way and allow it to dictate their actions. But the best that we can do is put in measures to make sure that international students in Australia are protected. And I think that generally we do a very good job of that.
Right, yeah. I do certainly hope that mates and any similar policies that may follow do take this into account, and students aren't forced to live in areas where crime is high. So I would like to go back to mates now, and we're going to conclude the podcast soon. I would just like to ask you, what are your views on the future of mates? Do you think policies in this fashion will succeed? Will they fail? What are your thoughts?
I think that these will definitely succeed. I think that mates specifically will succeed for a few reasons. First of all, the people that are being given places in Australia are young, highly educated and talented professionals. So they're going to fit in quite well to Australian society. They're going to be providing value. I assume that many of them will look to stay on as well, so that they will continue to contribute to Australian society. I think that as well, it's going to provide an opportunity for them to provide context about Australia back home, perhaps encourage more of their friends to look to make the shift. And at the end of the day, it's going to drive a lot of auxiliary effects. Recently, Air India announced a new direct flight from Mumbai to Melbourne. So there is going to be developments like that. There's going to be more business partnerships, maybe more labour mobility schemes in the future that allows them to bring family members over and things like that, or allows more two-way travel or visa-free travel between our two countries, because it's all going to be on the back of the fact that India has a product, which in this case is skilled labour, and Australia has the demand for that product. And I think that there's also, India is looking forward to getting a return on investment, because some of those people who come to Australia on mates will look to return to India, or will perhaps invest in India. Even if they remain in Australia, they'll look to come back to visit family. They'll come back with more purchasing power. They'll put more back into the economy here. And so hopefully it's the start of, more growth for both our countries, more two-way exchanges of people, and with that people comes goods, services, and most importantly, ideas, which is going to help us both innovate and solve some of the big challenges both our countries are facing.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Josiah. That was a very insightful conversation. And if I hadn't wanted to visit Australia earlier, I definitely want to now. So thank you for giving me the extra push. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for joining me.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the All Things Policy podcast.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.